books.
What else I got? Ooh, I got a fun one.
I got books. Analog games. Oh, very good.
Yeah. I've run a module out of this more times than any other genealogic ways module, more times than anything else I've ever run.
Oh, I can show.
All right, we're ready to go, Bill.
Terrific. Hi, I'm Bill White, and these are my colleagues, Nick Lalone and Nick Mizer. Wave hello, fellas. And we're here today to talk about a game studies project that we're beginning, a phenomenology of role-playing across TRPG scenes. And we're doing it in Zoom because it's we're thinking of it as kind of a data session. We've done a pilot interview, which we think is going to prove sufficiently rich that'll sort of reveal some of the things we're interested in seeing. And so we just want to talk about an overview of the project, show some of this data, and then reflect upon that to get people's comments and the things that critiques and questions and concerns, and sort of help us think through how we're going to proceed as we try to execute this project. So moving forward, we'll begin with the project overview. The idea, the thing that we said in order to sort of get some sort of IRB approval for this project is here's what we're up to. We're interested in comparing phenomenological understandings of play in different scenes. And so that positions us as having to talk about these two ideas. What does it mean, a phenomenological understanding of play? And when we say scenes, what are we talking about? And just a little bit of background, the project emerges from a conversation that Nick M and Nick L had about what is it, if we're going to go beyond the idea that system matters, how does it matter? In what way does it influence the way that people play? And similarly, Nick Mizer and I have both written books about different scenes, right? Different places where ideas about play are discussed and maybe inform the shape of play. But I want to give Nick Mizer a chance to talk about phenomenology because as an anthropologist, it's something that he's intimately concerned with. And so, Nick, if you just want to sort of talk about that a little bit, just to sort of say, when we say phenomenology, this is what we mean, and this is how it applies to RPGs.
Sure. I can say that, and my preface is I am not a phenomenologist. I do phenomenological anthropology, and so I have that. But I'm sure that there are people out there who can give much more in-depth definitions than I do. But when I talk to my game studies students about this, I describe phenomenology. I describe that I want them to take a phenomenological approach to their understanding of games. I describe it as a shorthand is that I want them to be connoisseurs of experience. In the same way that like someone can take a glass of wine and be like, yeah, smoky berry notes or whatever, to pay that close of an attention to their imaginative experiences, their experiences in play. So thinking very carefully about like, what does it feel like? What is your experience when you're imagining something at the table? How are other people's experiences playing into that? Finding things like, how much do people visualize in their imaginative practice? And so experience and phenomenology is written very, very large, and trying to sort of put aside as a methodology any distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, and just all of it is data coming in, not just sense data, but all kinds of data. And I think that lets us get really rich understandings of what's happening at the game table.
Yeah, terrific. And then the other concept, right, that we need to sort of pin down is this notion of scenes that we've sort of been throwing around in a very offhand way. But Nick Lalone, you've actually done some writing. I know you have a co-authored piece where you talk about art worlds as kind of a conceptual framework for understanding what's going on.
So, we talk a lot about what's going to happen at the table, what's happening at the table, but it's not consistent, right? We might have geographically based rules. We might have rules and sort of ways that people are playing that are common to, say, Roll20 versus, why can't I remember the other ones? And it might vary. I might be playing Powered by the Apocalypse, and that's going to have a particular scene given the people that I'm with, versus something like a Fate game that's going to have different interpretations of the world. The basic idea for scenes is essentially just a location. I'm looking at the paper that I wrote. A location where people get together to produce, perform, and enjoy essentially art in their capacity, or just in terms of, basic scenes, especially as time has gone on in the world of role-playing games. You have the Twin Cities group. There was a group out in California that was playing around at the same time. Then you start having all sorts of different crews start appearing. And I mean, right now we've got, I don't know if it's still possibly true, if this violent war is still going on between the story gamers and the OSR folks. Now we've got the Itch crew. There's all sorts of scenes, and they ebb and flow. And if you look at and sort of summarize a lot of the discussions and ways that people are sort of defining their particular area, you can gain a lot of insight into not only how to engage particular scenes, but maybe how to bridge scenes that aren't necessarily talking at that moment.
And dare I say that Metatopia is a scene, or a conglomeration of scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so where that leads us, right, in terms of kind of an overarching framework, I think is this, right? I think that, and this is as like simple a framework as we can possibly construct, trying to sort of remove as much of the theoretical language as possible in order to make it. One of the problems that we're going to face, I think, is interdisciplinarity, right? Is talking to multiple audiences in a way that's comprehensible and acceptable, right? That doesn't challenge any orthodoxies necessarily. But the basic idea is the player is the point of articulation for both the experience of play, those mental representations, that phenomenology that's going on inside their head, which we don't have direct access to other than through what they say about it, and through their location within these socio-cultural configurations, art worlds or play worlds that include both the individual group, right? Those individual sort of, the people who they play with, and then the larger scene, whatever we're talking about in that sense. And so what we have access to is the verbal articulation of play or verbal expression of what they've been doing. And that's what's going to give us access to, hopefully, both of those things, right? And again, not in an unmediated way, it's entirely mediated. And so there's some sense that, we have to engage in a process of interpretation and reading of those accounts, but nonetheless, that's what we have access to. And so that's, as I think, nitty gritty, a theoretical framework as we can offer, that will then let us add things in and talk about them in ways that are legible to other audiences. Fellows, anything to say about that? Anything you want to add, or before proceeding to this session?
I'm looking at this diagram that you made, which I really, really love. And I'm thinking, I didn't ask you this when I first saw it, but the circle that we have there in the center, are you thinking that's what we look at? And so the player, that intersection of player, group, and scene as presented through these verbal accounts. That's our lens. Yeah, that's our, so our lens, right, is we have what the player says to us, right, their verbal account of play, and then we have, the player, right, as a point of articulation, and the group and the scene are represented there in more nebulous kinds of ways because they are more nebulous to us, right? The player, we know, we can point to that person and say, this person told us this. And we think that person is located in configurations that are social-cultural. We'll pin down that language as we sort of work through the theoretical framework, but the language that I'm using, I'm borrowing from a sociologist named Margaret Archer, who talks about culture and agency, and she makes this distinction between the cultural system, right, the network of ideas that people have access to, and the socio-cultural level, which is the engagement of people with others and their attempts to articulate the cultural system to each other. And through each other in a way that produces both consistency over time, what she calls morphostasis, and change over time, right? The change in sort of social configurations, right? So there's some sense that that's what's going on. And that's what this diagram is intended to represent, right? Both the inaccessibility of everything but what the player says to us, and that sort of
embodied. The person as an embodied. Oh, habitus, right, is Bourdieu's term for that kind of embodied socio-cultural position.
Bourdieu.
Right? Like that. What's that?
Bourdieu, you're a calm guy. You're not allowed to talk about sociologists.
See, calm, you get to talk about whatever you want.
Oh, that's true.
Whatever
Hey,
you
speaking
want.
of communication,
Yes, sir.
we have this circle around player, group, and scene, but off to the side is this: today my ranger got the snippo. I'd like to talk about the snippo, and it's
Sure.
Because you have, we're watching the players, watching the group, or watching this sort of scene, right? You have different levels of analysis that are happening here, but within each of these particular things are what is being said. And so like language processing and sort of looking for terminology that might be different compared to scenes that might be doing sort of similar things. There's a lot of interest there that can come out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you recognize that sentence, but there was a story in the New Yorker called The Dungeon Master a couple of years ago, where it's just a short story about a kid playing D&D with a sort of a dysfunctional group. And the Dungeon Master takes revels in killing characters sequentially, and so but it's very interesting. It's a very interesting read for how it presents sort of this mental world of play, right? And so there's this moment where the narrator talks about like not in play, but just imagining his character outside of play, enjoying roasted boar on the fire outside of having resting from his wounds, from all the wounds he's taken during the battle. And I just like that sentence from it right today, because it does point to the notion of specialized language that may emerge, and it may be idiocultural in the sense that it's just from the play group, right? This is the way we talk about it. Oh good. So now participants are able to see it. Terrific. So that's at the group level, but then also we imagine there's larger scene level kinds of language use, or ways of talking and ways of thinking about what happens in play. And that's one of the things we're looking for.
One of the questions we have a sort of a question from Lucas in chat, which is, we're only circling part of the player. So does the entirety of the player show up in these analyses? Or
I like what you said.
What do you think? Say that again. Go ahead. What were you saying, Nick?
Well, I was thinking, I like that Nick talking in terms of background, backstage things, and it's only what the person is conscious of. The quote that immediately jumps to mind is that there's an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz who says he says that anthropology or ethnography, which what we do is kind of ethnographic, is a weird sort of science in which the further you go, the more you realize that you're not getting it quite right. So there's like we kind of build into our assumption that we're never getting either the entirety of the player's experience, and then certainly as we try and generalize out to we're talking to one player who's a member of a group, who's a member of a scene, our knowledge is always only going to be partial of that.
Or multiple scenes, multiple groups, different groups over time. So there's no way it can be complete, right? It can only be partial. What's interesting about that is, to a certain extent, at least in the phenomenological part, we're letting the player choose what to represent, right? And so we're getting that mental experience that way. But in terms of how they represent who they are and their sort of self-representation, we're actually, we do sort of ask some, and since we're at the 15-minute mark, I think we can go into the data session, but
if I can make one last point on scene versus group, and that's just to say that, and I think this has kind of come through, but that the relationship between group and scene is highly variable depending on who we're talking to. There may be a gaming group that is isolated relatively from any other groups, and so that group is their scene. There may be another, or if you imagine, I think of my friend Victor Raymond in Madison, Wisconsin, who at the tabletop gaming store there in town, they have a regular group, a regular scene there that's 5 or 6 different groups playing together. So that's like another scene. And then and we can think about scenes at multiple scales and things too. So just thinking about that's a fluid and dynamic relationship of it's not always the same relationship.
And absolutely, and that will emerge in discourse. That'll emerge in the talk, right? In terms of how people talk about the affiliations, the groups they belong to, the people they play with, right? And the people they talk to about games. this was just, so the reason for talking about the interview schedule is the idea that we thought about how each of those questions, right? The idea of scenes versus, the notion of affiliations, the notion of their participation, as well as how they engage in play are things we need to ask about. And then that's going to lead into a larger understanding of what's going on when people play. But now let's go to the data session. I think we're just about on schedule in terms of what we were hoping for in terms of timing. So we've done one interview in this project so far, and we're calling it a pilot because we're part of what we're doing here is going back and looking at our interview schedule and tweaking those questions in order to have them do more precisely or elicit, hopefully more reliably, the kinds of things that we're interested in eliciting. So part of our sample, as you see, we talked to a 52-year-old white male retired game store owner who describes himself as a semi-professional gamer with a strong preference for indie games, right? So already we're getting a sense of language and language use. But let's start here. And I know this is a lot of text, but I just want to let him elaborate on that notion of being a semi-professional gamer, because it's interesting what it suggests, right? So as we let you read that and think about the its implications, I think Nick Lalone, you had a comment that you sort of wanted to make about the process of reading and interpreting, and what does it mean to do an analysis or interpret what's going on here?
Well, so one of the things that I often hear, so a lot of my work right now is kind of detached partially from games. I'm talking to a lot of emergency management personnel about how to sort of get on board with the practice that they're in. And so one of the things that I hear a lot is, as an academic trying to work with folks within an industry, is how do I actually use any of this stuff? Like, what does it tell me? How can I incorporate what I learned from sort of discussions like this, or like from the work of the very first panel about academia, where you have a bunch of humanities oriented folks kind of pointing out certain things that are happening within games? How do you use it? What do you actually do with it? And I think one of the sort of the most important things to remember from this is that as humans who belong to particular groups, we have identities that are tied into all sorts of different spaces. We have ways to talk about those things and opinions that talk about these things. And so the sort of way that you use this is you start collecting those little moments of identity. If I am somebody who says, it means if I weren't getting paid a red cent, I'd be playing in 3 or 4 games a week, but in the modern world, you can sort of find a way to make a little money on anything if you do it right. So this person's talking about sort of the professionalization of play, but they still are talking about their passion as a person who sort of identifies as a player that would like this. And so this is an origin point, right? If they are a professional, is there a portion of their background that points to where that professionalization comes from? And for this particular person, they have a background in in performance, right? Their degree is in theater. And so their performativity within this particular space is going to be interesting. And the games that type of person plays allows us to sort of begin to hone in on, where would our market go, right? Who would buy the type of game that I'm making? Would it be this person? Would it be somebody else? And so I think that's what I had said I was going to talk about. Is that?
No, that's great. Nick, you unmuted Nick Mizer, so I take that as you want to say something.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think building on that, the other thing that we see here, and as we start thinking about this interview, is that we're dealing with a store owner, and we see them talking about conventions too. And so I think that when we think about scenes, and this person's role in relationship to scenes, is that there's part of what's happening is that there's a circulation of ideas about games, right? Particularly at conventions, but then especially or in any kind of semi-professional sense, if he's getting I haven't been very clear yet, but like if he's getting paid to run games for people, if people are saying like, I'll give you chip in $10 and you run a game for us or whatever it might be, then like that we could talk about it. Maybe it's not a scene in the sense that these people are interconnected, but there's certainly a role in gaming,
Right.
that a functional role that someone like that is doing of like circulating, because everything that he thinks of as a good practice, he's going to see. I mean, it's a small scale version of like what we call the Mercer Effect, right? Like that, like when everyone is watching Matt Mercer DM, then like their practices at that table have influence. And so like we think of these as circulating, because no scene is hermetically sealed. It's very permeable and always changing. So I think this is a really interesting person to be talking to because of that, like that role of like pumping the blood, so to speak, through the system.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I wonder, are there any comments from the audience? Any questions? Any sort of interpretations that or directions for exploration that have come up in the chat? Anything?
I imagine there's a whole lot of meaningful chin stroking going on.
You are.
Yeah, I mean, so just to say to everybody, like our ideal for this, if we were in person, would just be that everyone would be calling out, in kind of an interactive workshop kind of way. So if if you're looking at this and you see like, oh, here's a thought that I have that's probably really, really interesting, we want to hear it. Or if you have a question about something, like questions to it. So we're trying to be as interactive as possible in this asymmetric format.
I think that there is a degree to which there is a lot of text here. There's a lot, and it's a lot of in-depth things. So if you wanted to kind of give a summary of what each panel in what each page on this presentation has, and like the general information here, so that as people are reading through or just following along, they can give more informed points.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the thing, right? We're right. One of the issues with qualitative research, right, is that it stars the text, right? The text is what's central to anything, any sort of interpretation, right? And that leads to problems because, as I think it was Clifford Geertz said, the problem with qualitative research is that it's self-validating, right? You offer an interpretation and someone has to, read the text and read the interpretation and go, oh yes, that's obviously what's going on, right? And so either the interpretation is obvious or it's not, right? So it's self-validating in the way that either someone, listens to your interpretation is like, oh yeah, that's what's going on, or doesn't, right? So this first question, and Lucas, in response to sort of your notion that, it would be good to have a little summary here, is just this, that, here's this idea where we've asked a question. How do you describe yourself with respect to role-playing games, right? So the question elicits a response and an articulation of something. And this is what he said. Well, I'm a semi-professional gamer, is what I would say. And it's not represented here in the text, but I had to say, okay, well, what does that mean? And here's the response. It means, right, in this elaboration, that if I wasn't getting paid to play, I'd be playing anyway. I'd be playing a lot, right? And 3-4 games a week, that seems like a lot. But there's this sense that but it's semi-professional because I'm making a little money on it. I'm retired. My contribution to the household is to run the household, but I do this, I still do this. And so I make a little money here, a little here, I piece together a little something. Okay, great. Which speaks to, his identity as a gamer, right? As someone who is still able to, having once made a living at it, is still able to pull in a little money at it. So it's still, so there's some identity is all about authenticity, right? Is he still really professional in this space? And so are there notions of professionalism and amateurism, amateur status here? That's something that's possible to sort of see and to sort of say, okay, how do other people describe this? Ken McAllister, in his sort of rhetorical analysis of the way that people talk about video game culture, talks about sort of these, just the confluence of ideas about play, work, labor of love, and other ideas that we're definitely seeing pop out here, right? And so, our question to the audience is, as you read this, what are you seeing? Are you seeing anything that you think, oh, that's interesting, right? That's something that's worth kind of taking a look at? Anything that resonates with your own experience? And so that's kind of where we're at, right? So that's this first item. We should put the slides, put the link to the slides in the chat, right? So that it's in there, right? So people can take a look.
I think that this initial setup will like shape some of the way that we think about the other things going forward, knowing that that's the background of this person.
Right.
The other thing that brings to mind to me is, well, it puts me in mind of Tavis Allison had this great piece a while back where he described the history of gaming as, if you imagine the history of music, and instead of bands touring and becoming famous, what happened was that composers of sheet music became famous, and that's what happened in the initial wave of role-playing games. Is that like people knew designers, they knew people who wrote modules, but there weren't like performers, like we're not well-known individuals to the same extent. And the semi-professional mode, like I think, pushes like games as a culture closer to like music as a culture, so that you could describe someone who plays in a local band scene and is not trying to get on a big album or anything as a semi-professional musician, right? I think there's some interesting comparisons there.
Go ahead.
Okay. There's something interesting, I think, here where, because this is what we do for a living, we probably are forgetting some of the sort of really confusing portions of like trying to understand a text that's in front of us in a very rigorous empirical sort of way. And I think to that, if any of that stuff is happening, like where do I begin? What notions do I even underline or highlight? What do I pull out of this? And like a lot of this, what academic inquiry tends to be is curiosity, right? Like if I am interested in something that somebody says, I work conventions for a game distributor. That's interesting. There's something there. We've identified a quality of this particular person that we might categorize. I might create a category and just say, this is this is somebody working for a game distributor, and this is how they tend to feel about this. So I kind of create this profile. I have this quality, right? This is qualitative. I have a quality that I'm interested in. And now that I've established this quality, how frequent is it? And so this is where there's a relationship between the qualities that we have and the quantities that those qualities pertain to. And so what we're trying to build here is, even if we're talking to somebody who might not have any interest in what it is that we're looking for, the sort of survey guide or the interview guide that we have is meant to pull out and tease similar concepts amongst disparate types of people, so that we can start to look at qualities that might be shared across different bounds, across different boundaries. And it helps us try to not only show how people are relating to the act and the concept of role playing, but how they might actually be relating to one another despite being in different art worlds. And so it helps us sort of tease apart a lot of unspoken tensions that might exist within and between.
So we're about at the 30-minute mark now. We have a few questions and comments coming out.
Sure.
One kind of building directly on that is asking about what is the data that has value in this situation? Because you're kind of talking about what you decide to pursue. They're asking, is it the characterization of the player that is the thing that's valuable here, or the overall behavior of the group, or something else?
Yeah, I think all three of us share what is typically called grounded theory approach in academia, meaning, but I think that the more accessible term would probably just be called emergent. Like what Nick's describing is that we have one individual, and then we identify themes in that, and then we look for those themes as we go forward and we're trying to do like pattern recognition, I think is what we're saying, is like what are some themes that emerge. And so it's using the individual to get at things larger than the individual, but it goes through that particular person. That's how I would say it. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, no, right. So the grounded theory perspective would say, okay, you don't know going into the data what's going to be of value, right? You got to let that emerge, and it's iterative in the sense that, okay, having seen it, then, you go back and you can look for it in the rest of your data. And so the idea is that, we don't know. And so we're looking for things to pop out, right? And pop out in the sense that, we have questions about them. We don't necessarily understand. And so if we want elaboration, if we want them to say more about that, then that's probably a sign that it's something worth looking at. Isn't, Nick, that's what you meant, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the question that just asked about mechanics of play maybe suggests, like, I think if we move on to like our next quote, I think is where we start to get into some of these questions about like gameplay experiences that will
yeah, sure.
some of that.
So moving forward. So wait, let me see. I have a couple things to say. The first thing is, Nick, as Nick Lalone, as you were looking at this passage, and passages like this, the idea of nerdiness as a thing, and I think this speaks to this point, right? The idea of nerdiness as a thing that's emerging from, this one interview, and that being something that may be worth looking at further, right? Nick, do you want to talk about that a little more?
So this person's 52, so they're slightly older than me, which means I'm a child of the 80s. So this person would be kind of a child of the 70s, 80s, somewhere around in there. And so one of the things that really happened is, and I think this is kind of what birthed of a lot of what Nick and I were getting into, because it was where the nerd, the dork, whatever you want to call them, gained a spot in sort of authentic representations of a person. Instead of being sort of relegated to this sort of behind the scenes spot, we now are championing the nerd out there. And so to see this person who is of the age when the nerd would have been sort of something not to aspire to, seeing them getting chased out of, or sort of self-regulating themselves away from this nerdy stuff, and then sort of coming back to it. It says back when they went to college, right? So from junior high into college, right, there's this whole moment in time where things outside of the gaming scene might be reshaping how those gaming scenes work in. So they're 52, right? And there's something to that. Because if this person is speaking differently than to, say, who's a kind of a figurehead for this, I think I talk a lot about Greg Howitt. What would they say about like nerdiness and stuff like that? And so there might be a defining portion that we can start to look at.
Yeah, notion of biographical positioning, I think, makes total sense. So I wanted the thing I wanted to interject had relating back to something that Nick Mizer had said was this distinct thing about Tavis Allison saying, what if music was was composers rather than performers, and I wrote a piece for Analog Game Studies that looked at the emergence of actual play from a sort of media ecology perspective, and seeing in that, one thing that the emergence of actual play streams suggest, at least in terms of how people talk about them, one of the things that may shift is the valorization of the designer in favor of valorization of the game master, right? As a shift, right? As a performer thing. So there's definitely some legs to what Tavis was saying.
That is one thought that we have in chat, actually, that was brought up a bit earlier. That is, this interview specifically seems to focus on a further separation between GM and player, and how some scenes do value that separation, but other scenes don't, or actively try to collapse that separation.
Yeah. Right. And so that'd be an interesting thing to see, right? So it's not going to emerge in one interview, but over multiple. And we're talking, what's our vision? We're talking like at minimum half a dozen per scene, depending on how we define scene. But I think we're talking, 40, 50 interviews at a minimum, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that separation is really interesting. That and it's variable too, right? And in in like social structure jargon, what we would say is that what we would point out is that if I have a group of friends that meet at my house and we play a role-playing game together, then we are co-players. Maybe if there's a dungeon master, then that person is both my dungeon master and my friend, and they might run with me. Like we call that multivalent relationship, meaning that there's like it takes on multiple channels. And when you move towards professionalization, the person is more and more like just your dungeon master. The more professionalized we're going. And then if you use the music analogy, there's levels of that too, right? If I go to a local show that's just playing in the corner of a room, there's literally less physical separation versus like, when you start introducing stages and things. And I think that you could like, as we dip our toes into these professionalization scenes, then like there's going to be variables that we see in terms of how much separation people have between like that DM player separation.
Nick Lalone, are you going to add something?
No, but there's a question in chat that I think is actually, there's two questions in chat that I'm super interested in.
All right.
And that is, I'm not sure how to say their name. It's D.
I'm gonna move the screen forward.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But is the mechanic of play is different for different scenes? Are the behaviors the same? And this is sort of looking at the characterization of the player, the data, or I'm sorry, just sort of talking about like the system matter. And how often does that come out? And then for cultural context within a scene, is the success of a group more important than individual success?
Let me see. With respect to that first question, I think you're beginning to see a sense of that in this answer to a question about what counts as good role playing within this particular community. And so you're beginning to see that. Oh, this is, and it's not specifically role playing. I mean, no, let me not say that. I was surprised by the answer, right? I was surprised by the answer because it wasn't what I was thinking about when I was asking about this. So, but he said, oh, safety tools, right? We are proud to put pride of place to our use of safety tools, and we're trying to normalize them, and that's really important, right? So that gives a sense, right, of okay, here's a community that is pointing mechanically, specifically to this. And I even said, okay, so is that good design? And he said, yeah, to the extent that procedure is design, right? And so there's a sense of, and again, that sort of speaks to kind of a moving down to the level of at the table, what's going on at the table is being really important, really central. So, so that's the first question. The second question, define success, define important, right? I mean, and so here's an answer that says no, right? No, it's not. But I imagine other groups will have different answers, or I don't know. What do you think?
It's interesting too, right? Because when we're talking about success to this particular respondent would be, everybody was allowed to be themselves authentically and had no worry that they would be trespassed upon. And so to them, success equals sort of mutual experience.
Yeah, exactly. That notion of mutuality pops out very powerfully, right? If you look at, the sentence beginning, and we try very hard to, right? It's like the 6th or 7th line down, and we try very hard to like not make that punitive, but to make that sort of we all want to have a great time, and we all got like everybody is smart and is going to contribute, and we got a million ideas. So if we don't use one of them, just come up with another one, right? So the notion of creativity and imaginativeness as being like a feature here, and that's something that goes back like to the beginnings of role playing, right? Where people in Gary Allen Fine's Shared Fantasy, you can see people describing imagination as being a key feature of what it means to be a role player, right? So neat, right? But then this idea of sort of using that to frame, this is why safety tools are a good thing, because we want to make sure. And he even says, slightly above there, no individual contribution is more important than everyone's comfort in playing the game, right? So success in that context is not, we told a great story or we got a really vivid experience. It's no, everyone had a good time. So
there's something that strikes me that I didn't notice until we framed it this way in the context of this question, is that you ask this person what's good role playing look like, and they lead with the idea of safety tools. But then later, when you ask them, can you give me an example of a good experience that you've had? I can't remember how exactly that question is framed. We get a story that doesn't explicitly involve the use of safety tools at all.
Right.
So there's something about
got a great idea. Right?
Asking it in generalizable versus particular. I think there's something interesting there. And it also speaks to the first question that was of the mechanic being different for the scenes or behaviors being that I think safety tools is an interesting one that is we could certainly find correlation between scenes that play certain games and scenes that use certain tools.
Sure.
But of course you could deploy most safety tools could be deployed in any system, and I expect that we will find that that there's cross pollination there. Like we could talk to some people who play 1974 D&D only that might have inculcated ideas about safety tools. I don't know one way or the other, but it wouldn't shock me. So that a scene becomes a particular conglomeration of what games are you playing? How are you playing them? What are you doing when you're not playing them? Like it's all of these things as a
why you
family resemblance
right?
set of variables. Yeah.
Why I think so, but let's move forward, because I think the notion you just introduced that, right? The idea of so now we're beginning to talk to this informant about, well, tell me about, we actually get to go, hey, tell me about your characters, which is anyway. So so here's where he says, okay, the best bits, right? And he comes up with a very, and I'm asking, well, tell me the highlights, tell me what works, what are you looking for? What counts as, a session that you enjoy and what's going on? And so he comes up with this sort of general rule-like statement about, well, it's this, and the notion of collectivity comes in, we've seen it earlier and now it's popping in again, right? We've created all this stuff and everyone at the table recognizes that something new that was introduced was something we knew all along, right? That it was always already part of the game. And that's a very interesting idea, right? The idea that it's a collective realization or a mutual sort of, oh my God, that's perfect, right? And at the end, he says, like a jigsaw puzzle, you can't quite see, what it's a picture of, but then the last piece clicks in and you go, oh yes, it is this thing, right? And so when someone tells me something like that, when someone says, oh, this, I'm like, make that concrete, right? Because that, tell me a story about when that happens. Can you imagine? Like, and so it's, it's an accumulation, but here's a specific example. And so he points to one, and I apologize, right? There's a wall of text, but we're starting the text, right? Because this is where our data live, right? It's not in the abstraction, it's in the specifics. So we're asking him to put bones on, put flesh on those bones, right? And that's why it's the headline there is probe, right? And I can tell you, right? So he gives this example, right, where he's got a character, and that character is kind of as a foundling found at the edge of the village, this medieval village, and is sort of a kind of a wild child, feral child on the edge of the village. And he's wandering around in the forest, and he sees something scary. And so he runs to the home of the sun priest, who's got a big family, and bursts in the middle of dinner and starts to talk. And then he describes himself squatting in the chair and telling this story about the scary thing that he saw in between stuffing food into his mouth. And so he's, the player, the informant, is describing himself as player, describing these things, and then describing the GM contributing, oh, and the big family of this other character, the kids love it because, right? And so there's this notion that here's another contribution coming in, and from the GM, and that contribution sets up the another player's response. So the player of the Sun Priest says, "Oh, you shouldn't go. It's too dangerous for you out in the forest. You shouldn't be out there alone." And the informant as player says, and then I blurt out, "Can I just stay here with you?" And the other player, of course, says, "Of course." And then the GM introduces and all the kids cheer, right? All the kids say, "Yay!" Right? And so now there's this scene that's been established, and it's a nice little story. And then in the second column, there's a paragraph break, and then you have the players reflect, the informants reflection upon that story, right? What does the story mean? How does this serve as an example of the sort of thing that he's talking about? So, I mean, it's nice. It's really nice. I mean, you have to have the whole story in order to make sense of it, but there it is, right? He's saying, oh, you know, all of these things. I'm the orphan. I'm being adopted. The GM talks about the kids, right? The NPC children of the PC who's responding to me, and all of those things feed together, and all of a sudden in our heads, it's a domestic sitcom like a supernatural Brady Bunch, right? And we love that. And that, he notes that no one could plan that. That could only be emergent. That's what I like. And I thought, you know, that's a really good example of the kind of mutuality thing, collectivity thing that we're talking about. And it's interesting. One last thing before I cede the floor is that, you know, the connection that's made is to other media, right? So when Hendricks in Gaming as Culture talks about incorporative discourse strategies, right? The idea that, oh, a lot of what gets referenced is other pop culture, other media. So, you know, here we see that happening. And so, you know, super, super interesting right there. And so this is like a moment like this, you know, just makes you weep with joy about how beautiful it is.
There's something we should probably say, I think, about like academic inquiry. And that is one of the things that I hear a lot when I teach like introductory methods courses is all this is doing is telling me something I already know.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing to remember for this sort of stuff is like we are all part of the cultures and the scenes and all the stuff that we belong to. And the whole reason you do this stuff, especially if you're using it as this sort of marketing tool, where can I target my game being launched somewhere? Is allowing you to take this anecdotal, right? My perspective and looking to see how it changes in other people. Are there commonalities amongst all this stuff? You're essentially looking for common sense, right? Like if I can find something that a lot of different types of people share in different scenes, that's super interesting, even if it is a common sense concept within those particular things.
Well, and not to go too reflexive with this, but what you're saying that these students said, like, oh, this is something we already knew. I mean, that's exactly what part of what we're doing is the same thing that we're just talking about in gaming, is collectively realizing something that we already knew all along. Because often those things that we say, like, oh, we already knew that. Well, if you just go up and ask somebody, like, well, what's the point of X, Y, or Z, or what's this scene like? You have a knowledge of it, but it's not articulable. And so we're trying to articulate things that people sort of commonsensically know.
There is a question in chat, though, and a question of my own, where you talked about, you know, using this for marketing, or you talked about safety tools before, where that this does interact. It's not just a learning, you know, what is happening here, what does this person think, because there are goals that are associated with this kind of research, either for marketing or often games are used as a way of social change, the introduction of safety tools and the disagreements people have about if they should be used or not, or how they are used. Often people will want to be using this kind of information to see how to better prove a point or pursue something. We have someone in chat asking, do we want to reward good, in quotations, cultural values versus extreme uniqueness? Like, how does this research interact with these goals that people have?
That's terrific. That's terrific. I mean, that's a great question, right? And it goes to what the point of doing research is. And the thing that I was going to say, the thing I've been trying to say for the past several minutes was there's another audience too, right? And so in terms of the analog game studies, digital game studies divide, I mean, one of the audiences is the folks who on the digital game studies side who don't think about role playing that much, right? And so to talk about it as something that's of value and interesting, and to sort of understand that phenomenologically is another audience, right, that we're trying to reach. And so, you know, Nick's talk about marketing, I mean, speaks to a different audience, right? The idea that, oh, maybe this research has some utility to people who are designing games. And so when we're pitching it, or we're trying to get eyeballs on it, right? Get interest in it, as Bruno Latour talks about enlisting people in your research, you know, agenda and so forth. You know, the idea that we have something that's, you know, that this is useful in some way, right? Whether that's useful in terms of someone else's academic project, in terms of their understanding and framing of what they're up to. That's what I was talking about in terms of, oh, it's practical knowledge that can be incorporated in a practical sense by someone who's a designer and so forth. I think makes total sense. The question, reward, who do we want to reward, is really interesting to me because it implies that paying attention to the way that people play is somehow a reward, right? It speaks to the idea that we talk about in our IB proposal, and talk about confidentiality and anonymity, how, some people want consider publicity, right, to be a potential reward, right? The idea that, by paying attention to it, by, sort of being given credit for it in an academic piece will kind of, legitimize it in other settings and so forth. And that's just really interesting and something to think about, right? Whether that's true.
I read that question a little different. I agree with everything that you're saying, and that there's kind of multiple audiences here. I was reading that question as that's a question that we want to ask of various scenes,
Sure.
And so
because it's normative.
We come up this. I think that we all to some extent come up this with what we could call methodological relativism, where our job, I think part of what I view our job is, and our goal is to map the territory to some extent. Like this is what's out there. When Nick and I, the pre-discussions that we're having about this, one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about was this was when OSR, self-described OSR gamers, self-described story gamers were really having a lot of disagreements on a lot of different fronts, more openly than at least I see now. And really saying that I kind of feel like these are two sides of the system matters coin, is how Nick and I were talking about it. And so as we look at what are the goals that this interviewer, that this interviewee has for gaming, and how are they getting there? What we're looking, some of the things that we're going to be keeping an eye on is, do all of the people that we're talking to, no matter what the scene, share sets of goals that they have, or do different scenes have different goals? If they have the same or different goals, are they using different means to achieve those goals? So you might imagine two scenes that both say, this is what good role-playing is being surprised by something that you already knew. And this scene says, we get there this way. Another scene says, we get there this way. And so we're trying to map out that territory, I think, and trying to get the lay of the land in some kind of comprehensive but systematic way, rather than just anecdotal. It's in some ways,
It's super interesting, I think, to me, because thinking about this sort of same sides of the same or of the different sides of the same coin. Especially when we're talking about the reward of good cultural values versus extreme player uniqueness. I'm going to generalize here, and we can talk about whether or not I'm a horrendous person or not. But the OSR seems to, at least from the conversations that I have been having with folks in the OSR, they tend to see a lot of the safety rules as this sort of impediment to authentic expression of the self. So they are this thing that is impeding on their ability to be who they are. Whereas the story games tend to see these limitations not as this sort of inability to express their unique concept of who they are, but as a way to ensure that everyone has the same capability to express themselves as a person. Right. And so it's where do these safety tools lie? If the goal of role playing is to create this character and be your authentic sort of identity that you've associated with this character. And this ends up getting really intimately attached to the system of rules that are part of those games. Whereas in the OSR, you have these sort of meat grinders where you walk in with 16 zero-level characters, and one person walks out, they suddenly are given a name and they're allowed to be fleshed out. Versus this character that I have very carefully constructed from, a tiny character sheet. And now they are this amazingly immersive person. So there's a ton of stuff to get in there.
We've got less than 5 minutes left. And I see that Jason Cox has put a question in the chat talking about the Mercer Effect.
Zoom chat.
Zoom chat. So we're talking about Mercer Effect. As the reach of Critical Role has grown, the group is trying to bring in more diverse voices by having them as guests, as players or hosts, and allowing it to be molded. How much of an effort do we see to do the same in communities that are not in the public eye? Any thoughts on that, fellas?
I mean, I think that's something that I think of that more as like a really good input of Jason of like, if we can get information on that by talking to people. I don't know.
Well, you talked about,
I would have a hard time building that anecdotally, but I think that's a fantastic question.
I agree.
If we're talking about scenes tend to, and I mean, Dune's out now, which is all about the problems as the charismatic leader, but scenes tend to have figureheads, right?
Sure.
They tend to focus on a particular person, and like Mercer is a good example of this. Mercer has established essentially an art world around the performativity of role-playing games in some capacity. And so there are going to be people in each of the different scenes, and if they aren't excessively public groups and super popular scenes, we might not know. Right, like we could talk about Itch, we could talk about how it, and like the sort of cult around, not cult, that's not the right word, but the sort of group of people that sort of associate with that and mimic a lot of those things.
Terrific.
And, I think we're at time we need to probably wrap up.
So I think we should make a plug for, and Nick Lalone, you should put this, put the link in the chat and all the chats. You have? Okay. So, I mean, so clearly we need to, in order to, you know, our concern about validity is centered upon how broad a base of interviewees we get. And so Nick has created a form that people can say, hey, yeah, you can talk to me. I'm interested in telling you about my character. So we just want to plug that. So put the link in the Zoom chat if you would. Yes, great. So as we wrap up, let me just say I'm Bill White, Associate Professor of Communication Arts and Sciences at Penn State Altoona. And thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk about our research.
I'm Nick Mizer, lecturer at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and I will second that thank you.
You're muted, Nick.
Beautiful.
I'm not gonna thank it. That's thank you, everybody. My name is Nick Lalone. I am an assistant professor. I don't have tenure yet at the University of Nebraska at Omaha.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.